responsible sourcing program for CSRD Readiness. We'll start with a few housekeeping items. If we could go to the next slide. We are offering CPE credit for this session, so please take a moment to log into pollev.com/KPMG-0725 for the date today. Please go ahead and enter your full name and check in, and then keep this window open. Few more instructions on the next slide. We do offer CPE credit. If you are able to attend the entire session, complete both the check-in and check-out, and participate in all polling questions, please. With that, we'll go ahead and jump into the content for today. I'd like to start by introducing our presenters. My name, as I mentioned, is Blythe Chorn. I'm a managing director, and I lead our supply chain sustainability and responsible sourcing service offerings here at KPMG for the US. I have about 20 years of experience working across a variety of supply chain sustainability topics, starting my work very deeply in human rights and labor rights in the supply chain. So really excited to see the increased prominence again as a result of CSRD and other regulatory reporting requirements that we're seeing emerging globally. I'm also joined by Christine.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Prize, and I manage our social and environmental supply chain sustainability engagements across sectors. And so I've been working quite closely with our clients to prepare for CSRD requirements, specifically ESRS S2 workers in the value chain, which is our focus today. So we are going to go through 4 sections of content for you today before saving time at the end for audience Q&A, which is always the most interesting part, but we'll start by situating ESRS S2 within CSRD. We'll deep dive into what this ESRS S2 requirements actually are, how to prepare for the required reporting, and then closing out with how to use the ESRS S2 reporting requirements as an accelerator for broader responsible sourcing. So starting off with that context setting, we can go to the next slide. And I won't spend too much time on this background because through the fact that you chose to join this webinar, I'm going to assume you at least are broadly aware of the CSRD, but to situate us, it is a part of the European Green Deal alongside the EU taxonomy and SFDR, which you'll see on this slide. And essentially, the Green Deal is a set of policies that the EU has issued focused on shifting the EU to a more sustainable and responsible economy. And each of the major components of that Green Deal have some level of interplay with each other, supporting each other, for example, on definition setting. Essentially, today our focus is how the CSRD sets the legal framework and reporting obligations, while the ESRSs within that provide the actual roadmap for compliance. An important call out here is that despite it being EU policy, the CSRD requirements will apply to non-EU companies that have significant operations in the EU or that are listed in the EU, so very broadly applicable. And if we go to the next slide, this is just kind of a hierarchical view of the fact that there are 12 ESRSs providing that roadmap to CSRD compliance. There are 2 cross-cutting standards that will apply across the board, and then 10 topical standards that will be used as applicable. And the way you determine that as applicable is by performing a double materiality assessment. And based on the findings there, which will uncover the material risks, impacts, or opportunities for your own business as well as for external stakeholders across these topics, and where they are material, you will have reporting requirements. So among all of those, we're focused today on ESRS S2, workers in the value chain, one of the 4 social topical standards, and that's perfect. We can go to that next slide because we're then ready for our first poll. For those who are seeking CPE credit today, you can navigate to the Poll Everywhere window and submit your answer to the polling question. Looks like the vast majority of the room was listening to why we are here today on ESRS S2, talking about workers in the value chain.
And just to offer a little bit of clarification here, a company's own workforce is included in ESRS and CSRD reporting requirements. That would fall under S1. And we'll talk a little bit later about kind of defining those boundaries, because there are some key questions in drawing the boundaries, particularly around what represents a value chain for your organization.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Perfect. So getting into the content now, ESRS S2 has 3 primary areas of focus through which to understand those material impacts of and on workers in the value chain. The first is workplace conditions, and specifically the actions your company has taken to prevent, mitigate, or remediate poor workplace conditions in your value chain. The next is employee rights, emphasizing the importance of engaging with value chain workers to incorporate their views into your own decision making. And thirdly, we list here labor standards, which includes formal policies that you have in place to manage risks in the supply chain, such as human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, whatever may be most material. And if we go to the next slide, we know that these issues aren't affecting every single company across the board, and especially not every company evenly, but many companies will find these topics material, and for different reasons. So here it's purely illustrative and relatively high level, but we wanted to provide an indication of who may be needing to think about ESRS S2 the most, especially if you haven't undergone a full double materiality assessment yet. So we're thinking of companies that have supply chains that, number one, span many countries or include regions with pervasive or known labor rights issues, or include regions with ongoing or past instability. The fourth item we've listed here is supply chains that span many different activities and therefore tasks in different working conditions, or value chains that depend heavily on human capital or depend on subcontractors or temporary labor or other third-party services. And we can go to the next slide. And perfect. So we're back in poll 2 already. You'll only have 4 of these total, but for CPE credit, again, please navigate to your Poll Everywhere window.
Okay, great. So all of the answers that were provided are correct. Hence D, all of the above is the correct response here. But as Christine mentioned, we tend to see that workers in the value chain topics become material in human capital intensive value chains in conflict affected regions, and where there's a heavy reliance on subcontracting, and therefore that value chain gets longer, and frankly, in reality, often more opaque and more difficult to understand working conditions. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And we're going to deep dive now on what the requirements are for disclosure for S2. So the first thing we want to talk about is kind of what are our boundaries or scope, and this came up in this first poll question about own workforce versus value chain workers. And one of the questions that we get a lot in working with clients on this is understanding what that value chain is, and how do we define where that value chain starts and stops in terms of what we should be managing for workers in the value chain and therefore disclosing on. As Christine mentioned, this is really driven by your double materiality assessment. CSRD lays out that companies have an obligation to report on impacts, risks, and opportunities as identified via that double materiality assessment, that DMA. So for example, Most of our clients and most companies are really focusing upstream and talking about that supply chain and how products and inputs are produced prior to them taking ownership. But we do occasionally see some downstream impacts. So particularly if you think about being in the B2B industry, where there are decisions that are being made upstream and in your own operations that may have an impact on worker rights and health and safety downstream. So if you think about toxicity and chemicals, for example, some of those inputs that then workers may be handling downstream from your operations, but have the ability or the potential of impacting their health and safety and human rights. Those are the kinds of things that we would expect to uncover through that upfront double materiality assessment that would then guide you on which topics and where in the value chain you need to be managing those impacts, risks, and opportunities and disclosing. So if we go to the next slide, there are 6 different disclosure requirements that are covered in S2. And so I'm going to briefly hit on each of these, and we'll talk a little bit more as we go about where we're seeing some of the biggest challenges and risks in disclosing on each of these. But just want to start by giving you a high-level overview. The first is describing, again, what those material impacts, risks, and opportunities are, and how they interact with your company's strategy and business model. So where do you see resiliency issues? Where do you see business continuity issues? And really starting to define what those impacts, risks, and opportunities mean for your business. Next, there's a set of disclosures for S2.1 around the policies. So this is where we would be reporting on things like a code of conduct. And then in S2.2, you're asked to disclose about engagement processes, specifically with value chain workers. And this may feel a little bit different for some of you on the line. This is not just about broad stakeholder engagement, but really about engaging with the workers in your value chain. Step 3, or S2.3, is about remediation processes. So when non-compliances are found with your policies and with global human rights laws and standards, what does remediation look like to address those challenges that are uncovered? And what are the channels for value chain workers to raise concerns? An example here would be a worker hotline, for instance, but disclosing what those channels are that workers who may not be employed or have any kind of contractual relationship with your organization have to raise a concern about their human rights and how they're being protected and respected. S2.4 is about action steps. So this can comprise a variety of other disclosure points that your company may want to include in your CSRD response. Things such as how you're surveying workers, how you're building sub-tier visibility into your supply chain, how you're offering training, capacity building, etc. And then last is S2.5 is targets. So how are you setting targets for managing impacts, risks, and opportunities? Again, this is a challenging area, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in a moment. But just to say, there are a lot of different ways that we see this being done across industry, focused both on process as well as actual performance, and challenges with both approaches. So definitely an area to be thoughtful if you haven't set targets already, in doing so to meet disclosure requirements. So if we go to the next slide, we'll go to our next knowledge check, poll 3. And it should come up on fullev.com for you. It's a little bit of a trick question here. And we may have some participants today who have already gone through that double materiality assessment and already know the exact number for their organization. But in general, we would guide our clients to say that that's dependent on your DMA results. So we'll keep going here and start to get into some of the practicalities of how to prepare. When Christine and I and our colleagues have been working with clients starting to prepare for CSRD reporting and specifically S2, what we find, and not surprisingly, right, is that there's a large level of variety of maturity on managing worker rights in the value chain. And this is something that has been driven by global voluntary frameworks to date, as well as local and national laws. But we see more more variety on this topic than perhaps some of the other CSRD topics in terms of how far along companies are already in establishing strong programs to manage these topics and therefore being prepared to disclose on them. Our general guidance is that this is a topic that is very challenging to tackle in year one of reporting, and it takes a lot of thoughtfulness and engagement, as you've heard, with workers in the value chain as well as with other stakeholders. And so typically what we see is companies are needing to prioritize the data points that they're going to invest in the first few years to gather and collect and report on that really granular data. And so this is just a sample spectrum. It may or may not fit your organization and in terms of the level of effort implied. But what we tend to see is that there's a few things that are required in CSRD reporting that are pretty low lift and kind of easy for companies who are newer to managing workers in the value chain to take on and get done in that first year. And a good example of this is setting a supplier code of conduct. Many of you will find that there are already industry standards that exist that fit your value chain and the types of labor rights and human rights issues that would be present in your value chain. And we encourage companies to not recreate the wheel, but align with what their industry peers are doing so that suppliers are getting one consistent set of expectations from their buyers. So that's a really great, typically low level of effort place to begin. On the other end of the spectrum, we see a lot of challenges, particularly around workers' engagements. And so an example here would be of a really high level of effort disclosure point would be F, which is disclosure on how you as the brand or the buyer, the reporting entity here, are assessing that value chain workers are aware of and trust the structures and processes that you have in place to raise concerns or needs related to their rights and have them addressed. So this is, for to be specific, not just about having a worker hotline or a whistleblower mechanism. This is about understanding through direct worker engagement and third-party worker representation how workers actually understand the availability of those mechanisms and trust and use them. So typically what we see is that it takes, this can be a multi-year process, right? It takes putting those mechanisms in place, going through a communications and an awareness raising process over time, and then going to assess how workers actually understand and use and trust those mechanisms. So that would just be an example of a higher level of effort disclosure area that typically takes a little bit longer time to put into place and be able to disclose around. And so what we see as emerging as leading practice is really understanding what that roadmap for reporting against these requirements is based on the maturity of your organization today, what you're prepared to disclose on today, this year, and then what you need to start laying the groundwork and building in terms of programs and processes to enable disclosure in the future. So if we go to the next slide. Few other points that I wanted to hit on here in terms of challenges that we're seeing. And so we bring these up not to be discouraging, but because there's a lot of sensitivity around a lot of these topics when we're talking about workers and their livelihoods, and in some cases, even their physical safety. And so we want to highlight some of these challenges to illuminate the thoughtfulness and the consideration that needs to be placed on building the programs and the policies and the procedures that will ultimately support disclosure. We all know this is much more than just a disclosure exercise, but when we think about what it's going to take in order to enable disclosure, we wanted to call out a few key considerations. Obviously, there's a lot of challenge around the extent of reporting requirements and the impact on the business in terms of the governance, the processes, the data systems that need to be set up to support collecting and verifying and reporting on this information. One of the other key challenges is that we see as companies start to mature in these processes for reporting is moving beyond tier 1 and starting to get into tier N, sub-tier data collection, engagement, etc. This is where we find many companies don't have visibility to begin with. So everybody generally, some place in their company is going to know their tier 1 suppliers, right? Those are the ones that we're paying the invoices from. So we have that financial trail of information and data, if nothing else, that can enable us to go back and collect information and engage directly on these topics. But the ability then to understand who that tier 2, that tier 3 supplier is, particularly in highly commoditized supply chains, where we see the consolidation of the supply chain. Think about a grain silo, for instance, cotton, where it's all coming into a big warehouse. There's no traceability. There's and all these lots are mixed together. Really, really challenging to get that tier and visibility. And so, but from a double materiality assessment perspective, sometimes very crucial, because that's where we really see the impacts, risks, and opportunities. And then I want to also hit a little bit on engaging with value chain workers. This is a topic that I know many brands have been working on for many years, how to do effectively and safely. Value chain workers are often going to be quite reticent to talk outside of their organization, outside of their peer group and their community about what they're experiencing in the workplace. This is about their ability to continue earning their livelihood, and sometimes it's about their physical safety when we think about things like freedom of movement, freedom of association, etc. Very, very basic human rights that may be at risk in the supply chain already and can be exacerbated through the engagement process. And so this is an area where it can be very useful to understand the broader ecosystem, understand if there are workers' associations, if there are unions, et cetera, that can be engaged with as a proxy for talking directly with workers, or if this engagement is happening at the industry level. And that's something that you can partner on in a way that's going to be effective and safe for workers. And then finally, longer term, tracking the effectiveness of issue remediation. This gets into a little bit into being able to demonstrate and disclose on that progress and those targets. But it's a tricky one. For some time, we thought that non-compliances meant we walked away from doing business with that supplier. But then we recognized that there are others who will buy from that supplier. And in some cases, that can just exacerbate the violations of rights that may be happening in the workplace and in the supply chain. And so now the leading thinking is really that when non-compliances are found, there needs to be a significant effort around remediation. But tracking the effectiveness of that over time can be quite challenging. So worth thinking about, again, the people, the processes, the data collection that's going to need to happen to be able to disclose on that. Which leads right into the next point around integrating this into the business and how sourcing and supplier management colleagues are involved with engaging suppliers on these topics, tracking performance over time. And then the last piece is staying informed on changes to the reporting standards, as we expect these will continue to evolve. Let me just pause and note that I do see a number of questions coming into the chat. We're going to keep going just for the interest of time here, but we do have a large portion of the time saved today to come back to these questions. So we promise we'll get back to them. But for now, I'm going to pass it back to Christine.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so Blythe just covered a vast array of disclosure requirements, just in number as well as in difference of topic. So CSRD reporting is clearly a massive thing to get your arms around, and companies often ask just, where do I get started? How do I start preparing for this? And despite the impetus being from required reporting, ultimately these topics need to be treated like more than a compliance exercise, because the business value for you will really come into play when we're revisiting the level of integration into your overall sourcing and procurement programs and processes. But first things first, we just need to enable the reporting as soon as possible, because those compliance periods are very fast approaching. So we wanted to share with you all what we see working well with companies to prepare for the reporting while also proactively addressing those key challenges that Blythe just walked through on the previous slide. So this is a 4-step approach you'll see on this slide, which starts with a gap analysis and readiness assessment. This means performing data gap analysis, comparing your baseline data collection against the reporting requirements in ESRS S2. And because there's a lot that's brand new here, we often see this step supported by training sessions to build your internal capacity and understanding of what all this means. Second, we move into a data collection plan and reporting roadmap, where we prioritize what gaps identified in step 1 to fill and actually define how they will be filled. Then in the 3rd step here, we look to strategy development, which really involves aligning on a desired end state and thinking through how to manage any risks that may be associated with getting there and once you're there. And then finally, number 4 here, we look to overall responsible sourcing program design, integrating S2 requirements into the entire supplier lifecycle. And this is what we'll go really deep on in the next section of this presentation. But for now, if we go to the next slide, we can see that we will have our 4th and final poll. Please do navigate to the Poll Everywhere window and submit your answer, but then leave your Poll Everywhere window open so that you can process your checkout at the end of the session.
Okay, very good. Let's go on to the last section here then. And here we want to take a little bit of a step back and look at how we can use these reporting requirements as an accelerator for responsible sourcing and really building the right programs and procedures and policies to not only enable disclosure, but drive value for your business. So if we go to the next slide, something that you may notice if you've spent a lot of time looking at the broad CSRD reporting requirements is that the S2 requirements that I went through on the previous slide, there were 6 of them in that bar chart. They're all fairly qualitative, especially when compared to some of the other sections on CSRD, particularly in the environmental section, where it's a lot more heavily focused on data collection and reporting. And that is in large part due to the complexity of this topic, right? CSRD does ask you to report and set and report on targets, which are often going to be quantitative, but we recognize that the challenge of just focusing on outputs in protecting workers' rights can actually lead to a situation of less transparency where there may be non-compliance is happening. And so you see that in what CSRD is asking you to report, in that it's very heavily focused on more of the program design, the policies, the procedures, again, the governance structure, and the worker engagement, most particularly, that are going to enable those outcomes. And so that's where we think that CSRD is a great foundation for taking a step back and really looking at your company's responsible sourcing program and understanding if you're getting everything out of it that you can, beyond simply the ability to disclose and align with the expectations of CSRD. So our team works a lot with clients on helping to build that foundational program that will ultimately be disclosed through CSRD. And we typically go through a 5-step process that aligns very closely with what Christine just talked about. Because we're all worried and staying up at night right now because of CSRD, we tend to start there, as Christine outlined. But then this is kind of a double click into looking at what does it actually look like to build the programs and the policies that go behind that disclosure process. The first step is really about committing. It's about understanding what the business case beyond compliance with reporting requirements is for responsible sourcing, setting a vision for that in the company and a set of expectations on what you're going to achieve through doing this work, and delineating then those expectations for the supply chain through a code of conduct. Similarly to when we're just thinking about this from a disclosure perspective, it's assessing. And here's where we see a lot of intersection with the CSRD work happening in our client organizations. Of the double materiality assessment can be the perfect way to get to this assessment, to understand where are those risks, as well as the impacts and opportunities in the value chain on workers that you need to address. And then in step 3, defining the approach for engaging with suppliers and tracking performance with suppliers on these topics. Number 4 is about really going and systematically implementing your program with suppliers. So how do you communicate that code of conduct? Is there an annual check and refresh of asking suppliers to commit to that code of conduct? Do suppliers understand how they're going to be assessed? Do you have an audit program? Do you have a self-assessment? Do you participate in industry collaborations to monitor performance? But really rolling out the program, starting in those highest risk and impact areas, and then going more broadly, depending on what the value is in terms of managing risk and creating value for your business. And then finally, tracking performance, which ultimately will enable these disclosures. So if we go to the next slide. I've mentioned the business value a few times, and this may not be something that a lot of us are thinking about. Again, I know a lot of us are really just feeling the pressure of reporting requirements right now and trying to just figure out what those disclosures are going to look like. But having done this work for a number of years, and if you look at some of who the leading organizations are on these topics, you can see that there's clearly value in investing in protecting worker rights in the value chain beyond just meeting disclosure requirements. So obviously some of the softer topics like enhancing corporate reputation, we've all seen the articles in the newspaper where non-compliances are found and rights are being really threatened around child labor, around modern slavery, etc. Hard to put a P&L impact down on a balance sheet from something going wrong in this space, and I understand that, but there is really a corporate reputation and kind of brand impact for managing these topics appropriately. We also, though, see that working with suppliers on protecting rights in the value chain is a really crucial way to build stronger and more collaborative relationships with suppliers. I was actually talking with the former chief sustainability officer of a large apparel and footwear company the other day, and he was telling me that when he was managing contract manufacturing in Asia for his company, he used worker rights protection as a leading indicator of governance and management systems in the suppliers that he was working with, and as an indicator of suppliers' readiness to grow with the company. So this is often an indication of not just how well your suppliers are managing ESG topics, or just worker rights, but really what their understanding is of global norms and expectations around serving and partnering with and being part of a multinational value chain. It can really be an indicator of where there may be opportunity for a more strategic, deeper, more collaborative relationship with a supplier. And then finally, and very tactically, we see a lot of value coming out of this work because it fundamentally enables business continuity. Where we have worker rights being violated, and therefore we have challenges with employment, with labor stability and workforce stability, that leads to quality issues, that leads to OTD delays, that leads to all kinds of fundamental business challenges of getting that product out of the supply chain and into consumers' hands. We also see, again, when we have issues around worker rights protection emerging, disruptions in terms of inventory planning and being able to match supply and demand. So it goes back to that corporate reputation piece of when there's an issue and demand sinks, even if it's just for a moment in time, all of a sudden we've got inventory mismatches and so forth. So there's a lot of real business continuity reasons for managing these topics that ultimately we will see on the P&L. So if we go to the next slide, you heard me mention a little bit talking about starting with those suppliers where we see the most risks and impacts and opportunities, and using the double materiality assessment as a tool for understanding where those risks and impacts and opportunities lie in the supply chain. And then typically when we start to say, okay, what are we going to do about these? We start to think about it in terms of segmentation. So we want to understand, and certainly from a CSRD perspective, we want to disclose on those impacts, risks, and opportunities across the value chain. But we also, in terms of thinking about where we want to make investments, where we're going to put resources around tracking performance and then remediating performance and building capacity in the supply chain to manage these topics, we want to start to marry up that understanding of the impacts and risks and opportunities with an understanding of your company's ability to influence suppliers, so that we're not taking a one-size-fits-all approach, but really targeting your efforts where there are the biggest opportunities for you to create impact and minimize risk and impacts on workers. So we use a very typical consulting tool of kind of a 2x2 matrix, but we try to start putting together these different criteria to say, where do you want to simply take a very low level of effort approach, like asking a supplier to acknowledge your code of conduct once a year, versus where do you want to invest more heavily? So if we go to the next slide, you can see some examples on this 2x2. Things like asking for a code of conduct acknowledgement, creating a learning network for suppliers, asking for documentation from suppliers, very basic monitoring that's pretty hands-off. Those tend to be tools that we use widely across the value chain. Then as we move into that upper right, we start to go towards those efforts that are more investment intensive, because we think that there's opportunity for either really critical risk management or really high impact. And that's where we start to see more on the ground monitoring through using either internal or third-party auditors, but also which somebody might characterize as kind of the stick of these types of programs, but then also looking for the opportunities to share the carrots with suppliers, even going so far as to do joint business planning, giving more visibility into your forecast so that they can better manage their businesses, setting shared sustainability improvement targets. offering preferential contracting terms to those who are demonstrating really strong performance or consistent improvement over time. So again, the idea here is that we want to take a nuanced view using the DMA from a CSRD perspective as really the foundation to understand where those impacts, risks, and opportunities are, but then tailoring them appropriately based on where you can have influence and impact in the supply chain. And then if we go on to the next slide, the last piece of this, which often is the forgotten piece of this, is then thinking about how we can take all of these different tools and policies and procedures that make up a responsible sourcing program and start to think about how we integrate them into the supplier life cycle and into the way that your business partners, your colleagues in sourcing and procurement and supply chain are managing suppliers, so that this isn't just a program on the side that can sometimes just be noise for suppliers, but is really integral into how they help serve your company. So we look at starting with marketing when an RFP is issued, for example, very early on in the communication process before a supplier even starts doing business with your company, letting them know what the expectations are around workers in the value chain and protecting their rights, helping them understand how that performance is going to be monitored over time, and then building that in throughout the life cycle. So making those assessments, be it self-assessment questionnaires or audits, et cetera, part of the regular assessment process, generally, ideally combined with any other commercial assessment that you're doing, and then providing ongoing development and capacity building. So we're going to stop here. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions. And I see a few in the chat. Christine, I was glancing at them earlier. There's one on here that I want to put you on the spot for because you've been pretty hands-on with this one. And that is about engaging value chain workers. And the question specifically about without getting caught in co-employment issues, but I think that the nuance is engagement inquiry based versus giving direction, and how do we think about that? And particularly, I think you have some interesting thoughts to share about coaching auditors on that and how the role of auditors in worker engagement.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and something underpinning this question that also underpinned the other question that we got in the chat is just wanting to know what good looks like. And I think that's the question on everyone's mind, because so far a lot of this work has not been public and there are no CSRD reports out yet. So we can't look to necessarily public leading practices. But it's a great question about how do you effectively engage value chain workers. And beyond the co-employment issues, I would definitely bring in the risks that, Blythe, you mentioned within our presentation, some of the risks of retaliation and other impacts on the workers, truly their livelihoods here. And so one thing I will emphasize is definitely the auditor preparation and training to manage sensitive information and understanding upfront what the proper escalation processes are when you learn about something. And how do you handle that as the auditor in the moment if you're speaking with a value chain worker, and how do you handle it within the audit report back to the company who you're working for? And so we're definitely seeing an emphasis on the need for training before any auditors are speaking with value chain workers. But another topic we've been discussing at length with clients is how can you engage with value chain workers in other ways? May it be more effective to do so outside of the audit process because there are so many risks involved there. And so can you engage instead of directly with the workers, but instead with their credible proxies, whether that be workers associations or other unions? Or can you as a buyer come together with other brands in your industry and come up with a joint way to be engaging with workers in your shared value chain? So I think getting a little creative with the approach can also unlock some new opportunities to find that both effective and lower risk forms of engagement. And you're on
Yep.
mute.
Yep. I was just going to say, completely agree. It's a challenging area where I think even prior to the release of the CSRD reporting regulations, we didn't have necessarily one clear point of view on what good looks like or what leading practice is. And this is a topic that gets very nuanced when we're talking about specific types of workers and specific facilities, very different considerations for facilities that have um, uh, workers who are citizens of the country that the facility is based in versus migrant workers, where we have freedom of movement issues arise, for instance, where we're looking at younger workers versus more typical worker age. So there's just a lot of nuance. Gender tends to play a really significant role in worker engagement and how it can be done effectively. Even really, really little things like having female auditors engaging with female workers in the apparel sector, for instance. The results of those kinds of engagements are going to look completely different than when we send male auditors in to engage with female workers. And that's just understanding some of the complexity and norms in the cultures, in the locations that we're trying to engage in. So again, to Christine's point, this is where relying on, or at least collaborating with others in the value chain and in the ecosystem can be really, really useful. Others in your industry, as Christine mentioned, workers associations, some of the global non-governmental organizations like ILO, that has programs like Better Work that are in these facilities day in and day out, working on protecting workers' rights, and can be a really good proxy and avenue for engagement.
This latest question we got, I think, is something that's also on a lot of minds right now. How do you manage or engage with value chain workers in the tier 2, tier 3, up to tier N? And I would add on a part of that to hear your thoughts on, Blythe, of how do you even figure out who your tier N is before you even know how to engage them?
Yeah. And I think it's kind of part and parcel, right? Because you're not going to be able to go around a tier 1 supplier and go engage directly with a tier 3 supplier until you figure out who that tier 3 supplier is. So this is where, similar to those of you who might be working on scope 3 emissions and looking at things like the supplier cascade tool, this is where we really see the flow of expectations through the value chain. So the key first step is engaging with those tier 1 suppliers, even if that's not where your most material impacts, risks, and opportunities lie. But that engagement, one, make sure that there aren't ununderstood or unidentified risks in tier 1, but then the idea is that you use that engagement to unlock tier 2 and beyond. So in engaging with tier 1 and setting expectations with tier 1 suppliers, part of those expectations are that they are then engaging their suppliers. And often they're going to need your support to do so. Again, this is where I'm a huge advocate of industry collaborations, because it's a lot for any one company, any one buyer, any one brand to take on all of that sub-tier engagement from a pure resource efficiency point of view, right? But at the same time, your peers in your competitive firms in your industry are all probably sourcing from a pretty similar group of suppliers. And so there's a lot of opportunity and advantage to working as an industry for that sub-tier engagement. It does bring up some anti-competitiveness concerns for sure. So if you're thinking about that, yes, they are real. They have been worked through historically. And one example that I'll give is an organization that I've had the pleasure of working with off and on for years, which is the Responsible Business Association. And they actually have tier 1 suppliers and even some sub-tier engagement in that industry association, which helps unlock and again cascade those expectations through the value chain. And there's really good precedent through groups like that for overcoming some of those anti-competitiveness concerns.
One thing I'll take kind of a component of the first question we got and then pull it into what we've been talking about, which is, it sounds like a lot of like pushing out expectations to suppliers, requesting information from them, asking them to do X, Y, and Z. How can we, and what do you see working for companies to work with their suppliers to make sure that the suppliers are really supporting any, for example, engagement or grievance mechanisms being rolled out on the ground? And then more broadly, what are you seeing working to establish shared goals and really make this collaborative? Because I know we really like to approach this, and the professionals that we work with like to approach their suppliers as thinking of like true partners. It's not just transactional. So, what do you see building up that true partnership and the shared goals? And you're on mute, unfortunately.
I apologize. I have some background noise. We have another question that just came in with a couple of thumbs up. So I think this is a question on a lot of people's mind about the overlaps between CSRD and CSDDD. Do you want to jump in on that, Christine?
Sure, yeah. So I would say that they are complementary as opposed to overlapping. And so CSDDD gets more into how do you execute the due diligence in your supply chain, whereas the CSRD S2 is more about reporting on your policies and management frameworks, especially for those findings. And then the CSDDD is more about ensuring that you've actually executed your due diligence processes in the right way to get findings that are meaningful and not miss any unknowns.
Yep, and I would just echo that and agree with that, to say that CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, you hear it in the name, right? It's really about that due diligence, but to Christine's point, it's a very complementary, it takes a very complementary viewpoint or approach to thinking about ultimately how do we drive enhanced human rights management in the value chain, by taking that risk-based approach. So it's really, again, very similar to the DMA, thinking about where are those risks, and then having the ability to demonstrate that you've done the due diligence through the value chain to the raw material level, to uncover non-compliances and address them. So very, very, as Christine was saying, very complementary, much more about what we spoke about in the latter half of this webcast about program design and how you're actually managing these topics, rather than CSRD, which is the focus is more on what you disclose. Can't have one without the other.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome you to put any other questions in the chat. We've got probably about 3 minutes before we'll close out. Christine, any other questions that you're hearing a lot from clients that might be useful to talk through here?
This is getting quite tactical, but kind of roles and responsibilities, right? Because a lot of the topics we're addressing typically have sat in the corporate sustainability function, but need to be executed in supply chain management, procurement, sourcing functions. And, I'm hearing a lot of just kind of how do we begin to bridge that divide? Whose responsibility is whose? What's the long-term vision and how do we reach it?
Yep. And at the same time, we're seeing a proliferation of ESG related roles, right? So with CSRD and other reporting requirements, we may even have on the line today ESG controllers and legal teams who are getting more and more involved in sustainability. And so, yeah, it's a really challenging question, because I think even before some of these reporting regulations came into place, we didn't really have it figured out. And now we have even more players at the table, and everybody's kind of looking at each other, right? Going, who's in on first for this? The way that we see leading companies starting to tackle this question is thinking about it in terms of what do we have to disclose? And who's going to manage the disclosure process, which comes, as we know, with a lot of risk and a lot of legal implications for what we disclose publicly as a company. Who kind of is advising the organization on what is leading practice, which should overlap with disclosure requirements, but doesn't always. And there is often opportunity to do more and go above and beyond, right? And then for this topic specifically, who's talking to suppliers every day and who do suppliers listen to? And for me, that's a really critical piece of this governance piece, which is who in your organization is going to have the most influence on suppliers. And I can say, as a nearly 20-year sustainability professional, it's not sustainability. I wish it was. I don't sign the contracts with suppliers, right? And so we really spend a lot of our time working with clients, helping to integrate these topics into sourcing and procurement and supplier management, and starting to weave them into how we manage commercial relationships with suppliers, because that's where the influence really lies. And we want to start to bridge the gap to say, all of our traditional sourcing metrics continue to be important: quality, on-time delivery, pricing, etc. But we also, as an organization, face all of these disclosure requirements, know that there's real business value in performing well on them. And so we also expect, not just because we want to put out a glossy sustainability report, but because it's integral to the supplier relationship, we also expect strong human rights performance, amongst other ESG topics. So while it's getting the kind of who's on first question it's getting more muddied with regulated reporting. We also see that it's getting more clarity in terms of really pushing the day-to-day management, data collection, and communications with suppliers into sourcing and procurement, asking legal controllership, risk management, et cetera, to own the more disclosure reporting focused requirements. And then we usually need somebody kind of in the middle who's lifting their head up and saying, what are emerging human rights issues, topics, best practices, et cetera, to help set those standards.
Absolutely. That was an incredible rundown. And just, I want to flash our checkout instructions back up on the screen, as I know folks are probably jumping to their next call at the top of the hour. So to get that CPE credit, please do process your checkout form. And sorry to cut you off, Blythe. Just want to make sure we got our housekeeping in order.
We'll wrap up right on time. Really appreciate everybody joining today. And please feel free to reach out if we can help talk through any questions that came up that we didn't get to answer today, or any considerations that you're working through as you prepare for disclosure and hopefully designing more robust and meaningful responsible sourcing programs.
Thank you, everyone.